Historically, the term communists, or its abbreviation Reds, has been applied to people from a wide array of different political ideologies. For example, during the Spanish Civil War, the Phalangists called those who were fighting against them Reds, even though they ranged from liberals to anarchists, state communists of different kinds, socialists, council communists, syndicalists, anarcho-syndicalists, etc. In the Western world, in places like the United States, the term communist or Marxist applies to a similarly wide array of ideologies. The lack of distinction has to do with the fact that the clumping of all ideologies into one monolithic term helps ostracize and vilify people who challenge the elite or espouse radical ideologies. I mean, even examining the distinctions of these ideologies is dangerous because it prompts people's curiosity and may undermine the status quo. Of course, the difference between, say, a Stalinist and an anarcho-syndicalist is vastly superior to the difference between the candidates of American parties, such as the Republican, Democratic, Libertarian, and constitutional parties. Nevertheless, the American media and scholarship never clump all of them together as capitalists or state capitalists. So notice the double standards. When talking about people who uphold the status quo, the differences, distinctions, and supposed wide array of voices and choices among them are emphasized. But when the media talk about communists or Reds, they do the very opposite. This, of course, also applies within the statist framework. So, for example, a state like Cuba has very different national and international policies than North Korea, for example. And it has a much better healthcare system, and it is less militaristic, and so on. That has no bearing on the label communist. And once again, there are many more differences between the Cuban and North Korean government than between the governments of Democratic and Republican parties in the United States. And as we all know, according to corporate media reporting, the democratic elected government of Venezuela is just a few steps away from murderous communist totalitarianism and Siberian gulags. They are the next North Korea, we are to believe. In contrast, wealthy state capitalist countries like the United States don't want to be associated with capitalist countries like Guatemala, Haiti, Bangladesh, or with the hundreds of millions of victims of capitalist colonialism, or with the over 100 million people that died in India between 49 and 79 under a system based primarily on private ownership of the means of production. Of course, the atrocities of the United States itself in places like Vietnam, Iraq, Nicaragua, etc., are never labeled capitalist. Or take, say, Indonesia. When the Indonesian dictator Suharto came to power with U.S. support, killing about 700,000 people, mostly landless peasants, or when he committed genocide in East Timor, killing hundreds of thousands of people, the media never referred to it as a capitalist genocide, or clumped it together with the actions of other capitalist states like Spain, the United States, Bangladesh, etc. Well, Suharto was a right-wing capitalist, and his actions were greatly welcomed by American investors, and were even called a gleam of light in Asia by the American media, while his victims were often dehumanized by being labeled communists. In contrast, the label communist was always applied when talking about the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, right around the same time, without, of course, mentioning the preceding and comparably genocidal U.S. bombing of Cambodia, which in fact brought Pol Pot to power by creating an enraged army of peasants ready to seek revenge against anyone who they saw to be allied with the United States. As I mentioned in my last video, though we often hear of communist rebels or communist terrorists or communist dictators or communist troops, we never hear about capitalist rebels or capitalist terrorists, capitalist dictators, capitalist troops, etc. All these terminological double standards are naturally not limited to the word communism, but they extend to the entirety of political commentary. One of our tasks as activists should be to identify these terms and understand their propaganda function. That is part of the process of liberation.